Well, how about that Amenhotep? So, in the second part of today's episode, we are going to look at Middle Kingdom Egypt. You know the drill, so let's get going.
Middle Kingdom Egypt. Focus question. Though Middle Kingdom pharaohs were powerful, they lacked the same prestige that early pharaohs had. Why is this the case, and what evidence is there for this? Alright. Well, this is a shorter lecture today, which I would imagine most of you don't mind. But what I want to do is I want to look at this Middle Kingdom. Before I do, I want to talk about the breakdown of the Old Kingdom. Things seem to be going smashingly. What happened? I mentioned these intermediate periods. Well, why? What went wrong? Well, one of the things that we begin to see is pharaohs begin to alienate some of their land. Remember, they own it all, to temples. All right, so these pious pharaohs, even though they're gods themselves, they supported these temples. And this made the priests independent of the pharaoh. They didn't quite need them in the same way that they did anymore. Now that they had their own land, they could support themselves. We also see the growth of new gods, particularly the god Ra, the sun god. And the worship of Ra, supported by these temples, became a rival to the worship of the pharaoh. Early Egypt, pharaoh was kind of like the only god in town, but now we have gods like Ra who are dividing people's attention. And these temples began to suck up resources that would have gone to the construction of pyramids. And so one of the things that we start to see toward the end of the Old Kingdom, as the pharaoh's power was weakening, is that the pyramids become poorly constructed and smaller. These pharaohs just weren't quite as powerful and as prestigious. We also see increasing amount of independence from local governors, these nomarchs as they were called, these leaders of the nomes. Now early these were trusted members of the pharaoh's family, but in time these positions tended to become hereditary. Fathers would pass them down to sons, and these individuals would become more or less independent of the pharaoh, like the temples were. Now early it had been a big honor to go and get buried near the pharaoh, but increasingly these nomarchs are spending more time in their home territory and just getting buried there instead. Well, with the weakening power of the pharaoh, the first intermediate period came about. And the first intermediate period, dates vary, but about 2200 BC to about 2050 BC, about 150 years. And during this time, the authority of the pharaoh broke down. There were a lot of local strongmen who had come to power. Nobody was really recognized as the pharaoh. It was kind of a time of chaos, not a good time for Egypt. Of course, with no pharaoh, there wasn't really building going on the same scale. The art becomes poor and crude because there's nobody to support the artists. And so it's looked upon as a pretty bad time in Egyptian history. But in time, a new dynasty of pharaohs emerged, and they emerged from the city of Thebes, another important city from Upper Egypt. And they were able to unite the whole country, and they inaugurated this Middle Kingdom. The 11th, 12th, and 13th dynasties are all classified under this Middle Kingdom. Now, though these pharaohs were really important, and they never quite achieved the same level of power that the old pharaohs did. They had to still contend with these powerful priests who still had their own land, and these nomarchs who were much more independent than the previous nomarchs had been. And so in the Middle Kingdom, we don't see quite the same level of public works. This is evidence of the fact that the pharaoh wasn't quite as powerful as before. And the pharaoh wasn't even the only sole source of immortality anymore. So before the pharaoh, you want to get as close as you possibly can to him. Well, in the Middle Kingdom, this isn't the case. And part of it is because, well, theology, the teachings, the religious beliefs had changed. And we start to see a new cult emerge, the Cult of Osiris. Remember, Osiris was the god of the dead. And it now became possible for individuals, anyone really, to take part in these rites, these ceremonies. This was a rite originally reserved for the pharaohs. But now, Egyptian belief began to revolve around this idea that anybody could have direct access to Osiris and some of the other gods. And there were temples who would cater to this sort of thing. And if you had this direct access to Osiris, well, anybody might enjoy an afterlife. And so one of the developments that we see, and this is an important development for Western civilization, is the democratization of the concept of the afterlife. That, it's not just pharaohs or powerful people that have it, but really anybody can take part in the afterlife if you develop a relationship with this god. And this is considered a major milestone in the development toward ethical religions. All right, ethics is how you behave. And so part of getting into this good afterlife was to lead a good life. And so the ancient Egyptians believed that Osiris would weigh one's heart against a feather. And so the feather was a symbol, remember, Ma, or justice, and your heart was, well, how you had lived. And so if you'd lived a good life, well, then your heart would be lighter than a feather, and you could enjoy a good afterlife. And if not, well, you got fed to this hideous half hippo, half crocodile-like creature. And so we see some important developments, not only in terms of people, getting an afterlife of their own, but also in terms of religious development. New Kingdom Egypt was also a time of great temple construction. So many of the temples that people like to go to these days when they go to Egypt were built during this time. Again, it's not a time of great pyramid construction. Pharaohs weren't quite as powerful anymore, but it's a time of great temple construction because these temples were incredibly powerful. And so if you ever go to Egypt and see Karnak and some of these other places, they were built during this time. Okay, again, I said it was a short lecture, but what I'd like you to do is answer this question. Though Middle Kingdom pharaohs were powerful, they lacked the same prestige that early pharaohs had. Why is this the case, and what evidence is there of this? So answer this question and then our larger discussion question, which will incorporate both parts of this together, and I'll see you next week.